The Irresistible Revolution, Living as an Ordinary Radical by Shane Claiborne, Chapter 11, Making Revolution Irresistible. Dumbfounded and outraged by the apathy of the church, I've at times gravitated towards circles of social dissenters, protesters, and activists. We've shouted at the system that was hurting so many of our friends, and we've yelled at the church to wake up. But I saw very little fruit from those days. My ripped jeans and punk rock hair made me feel pleasantly distant from the filthy, rotten system. But I also found myself estranged from sincere folks who were polarized by the way we preached the truth. I went to the rallies and marched in the streets. I got arrested for nonviolent direction action and civil disobedience over and over, losing count after around a dozen times. But my hopes for a perfect revolution were dashed by human imperfection. Among my activist friends, I began to feel a self-righteousness mirroring that of a conservative Christianity. I felt an aggressiveness, a judgmentalism, reminiscent of that which I had grown to despise in the church. I sat through a meeting to plan rallies and marches where people argued and gossiped like the best church committee and trustee meeting, destroying one another in their favor to build a better world. I handed out flyers to convert people to the movement and felt as coercive and detached as I did handing out Christian tracts at the mall, facing statistics that have faces. But then I discovered a different kind of protest. Years ago, I attended a rally against sweatshops overseas. The organizers had not invited the typical rally speakers, lawyers, activists, academics. Instead, they brought the kids themselves from the sweatshops to speak. Awesome. I listened as a child from Indonesia stood to share and pointed to the giant scar on his face. I got the scar when my master lashed me for not working hard enough. When I began to bleed, he did not want me to stop working or to ruin the cloth in front of me. So he took a lighter and burned it shut. I got this making stuff for you. I was suddenly consumed by the overwhelming reality of the suffering body of Christ. Jesus now bore not just the marks from the nails and scars and the thorns, but a gash down his face, for we have done it to the least of these. We have done it to Christ himself. How could I possibly follow Jesus and buy anything from that master? The statistics now had a face. Poverty had become a personal, and that messes with you. Not too long ago, I was speaking at Princeton, and some of the students asked me how they were to choose which issue of social justice is most important. The question made me cringe. Issues? These issues have faces? We're talking not only about ideas, but also about human emergencies. My response to the well-intentioned Princeton students was, don't choose issues, choose people. Come play in the fire hydrants in North Philly, fall in love with a group of people who are marginalized and suffering, and then you won't have to worry about which cause you need to protest. Then the issue will choose you. Don't get me wrong. There are times when injustice will take us to the streets and might land us in jail. But it is our love for God and our neighbor, not our rage or our arrogance, that counts. One of my favorite old protest songs goes like this. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are fighting for our lives. Street protest signs and bumper stickers often flash the slogan, if you're not angry, then you're not paying attention. I got angry and was often ready to flip some tables. I rocked out to Rage Against the Machine. I got no patience now, so sick of complaints now. The time has come to rage. In college, we prided ourselves on stirring up stuff. Our group raged against complacency. In fact, originally we tried to call ourselves Youth Against Complacency, but yak sounded something like was about to hurl. So we went for Youth Against Complacency and Homeless Today, the yacht club. Kind of had a ring to it, and we hoped to squeeze some money out of curious boaters. While most activists could use a dose of gentleness, after all, it is a fruit of the Spirit, I think most believers could use a dose of holy anger. Years ago, I came across an old prayer of a Danish pastor named Kaj Monk, which I had torn out of a community newsletter and printed by our friends. Monk was an outspoken priest and playwright who urged these prophetic words before he was killed, with his Bible next to him, by the Gestapo in January 1944. Careful, I could get you killed. What is, therefore, our task today? Shall I answer? Faith, hope, and love. That sounds beautiful, but I would say courage. No, even that is not challenging enough to the whole truth. Our task today is recklessness. For what we Christians lack is not psychology or literature. We lack a holy rage. The recklessness which comes from the knowledge of God and humanity. The ability to rage when justice lies prostrate on the streets and when the lie rages across the face of the earth. A holy anger about the things that are wrong in the world. To rage against the ravaging of God's earth and the destruction of God's world. To rage when little children must die of hunger, when the tables of the rich are sagging with food. To rage at the senseless killing of so many, and against the madness of militaries. To rage at the lie that calls the threat of death and the strategy of destruction peace. To rage against complacency. To restlessly seek the restlessness that will challenge and seek to change human history until it conforms to the norms of the kingdom of God. And remember, the signs of the Christian church have been the lion, the lamb, the dove, and the fish, but never the chameleon. There are plenty of violent revolutions during the times of Jesus, and Jesus had several zealots in his inner circle, but he was teaching them another way of life. I am reminded of how Gandhi said that if he had to choose between a violent person and a coward, he would choose the violent person. For a violent person can be taught to love, but a very little can be done with a coward. We are students of a gentle revolution, and that is what the world needs more of. Whether you're conservative or liberal, it was an Argentinian doctor and a pop revolutionary icon, Che Guevara, who said, as he was leaving Cuba for Africa, "Let me say, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by the great feelings of love." Just as believers are a dime a dozen in the church, so are activists in social justice circles nowadays. But lovers are hard to come by, and I think that's what our world is desperately in need of. Lovers, people who are building deep, genuine relationships with the fellow strugglers along the way, and who actually know the faces of the people behind the issues they are concerned about. We are trying to raise up an army, not simply of street activists, but of lovers. A community of people who have fallen desperately in love with God and with suffering people, and who allow those relationships to disturb and transform them toward a gentle revolution. While at Eastern University, the yacht club stirred up all kinds of dust when the administration bought fancy trash cans. We found out how much they had cost, hundreds of dollars each, and then they put huge 3-foot price tags on each one to creatively critique the expenditure. We stirred up students on various campuses to research who makes the athletic team's clothing and whether those companies use sweatshop laborers. But the moments that were most transformative, that had the most lasting significance, were those done with gentleness and personalism. One of the most creative things we did was Arthur Jackson Appreciation Day. Arthur Jackson Inc. was the company that provided all the housekeeping staff for the college. As students build relationships with the housekeeping staff, we wanted to show the folks who cleaned up after our messes and held our campus together that we cared about them and appreciated their continual work. Yacht clubbers organized an annual holiday when dozens of students cleaned up the entire campus so that the staff could have a paid day off and know that they were celebrated and loved. Years later, we began asking new questions. One of the janitors happened to end up living on our block in Kensington. We found out that he wasn't making enough money to support his family, earning just over $6 an hour. The administration, students, and alumni had already begun to ask questions about the workers' wages at Eastern University. The same year, David Black, the president of Eastern University, came down the simple way for our Christmas party. It just so happened that my neighbor, the janitor, also showed up. So we said, "Hey, let's all sit down and talk." That's when things are transformed. when people become human, neighbors, family. Thanks to the hard work and courage of voices of faculty, students, and Dr. Black himself, Eastern University made a courageous step. They agreed to provide a living wage to workers, along with the transportation assistance and benefits. Now when I speak to students, especially Christian students, I remind them that we must not ask only about the academic quality, social life, and aesthetic beauty of the universities we are considering attending. We must also ask how these institutions incarnate the values we believe in, especially Christian institutions that proclaim the gospel of God's justice. Students have begun talking about how Eastern could have been more faithful caretakers of God's creation, tread more lightly on God's earth, and use renewable energy. In a respectful dialogue, the administration again took a bold step to move toward wind energy, one of the first Christian colleges to do so, and they, in turn, are finding that they will also gain, as they attract the sorts of Christian disciples who care about things like workers' rights and the environment, the gentle revolution, the invisible people. One of the groups many of us in Philly have grown to admire because they exemplify the gentle revolution is the coalition of the Amalki workers. They are farm workers and day laborers who pick tomatoes for companies like Taco Bell. We've worn out some shoes together, marching hundreds of miles in protest. One summer a few years back, the workers told us they were organizing a walk for their fields in Florida to the Growers Association of Orlando. As usual, we joined them. On the back of a truck, a 14-foot Statue of Liberty led the way, only instead of a tablet, she held a bucket, and in place of a torch, she lifted up a tomato. Along the way, hundreds of pedestrians came by to voice their support, along with actors, musicians, politicians, and clergy. They made headlines in nearly every town we passed through. As we neared Orlando, public attention had reached a pinnacle, and the police told the workers they could no longer have the statue on the back of the truck. We were disappointed, but one of the workers grabbed me. They said they could not have the statue on the truck, he said pensively. So we will carry her. He was serious, so each of us grabbed a corner and hoisted her up on his shoulders, and we began walking. Taking turns, one of the mighty women who helped carry the statue whispered, "If Jesus can carry the cross, we can carry the statue." And we did. Dripping with sweat, singing and chanting, we carried her to the front doors and of the Growers Association. It was a sacred moment. The executives tried to ignore them. They issued a statement that the tractors don't come up to the farmers and tell them how to run the farm. With tears in their eyes, these workers with calloused hands and leathery skin from long days in the sun-scorched fields carried out as if to God, "We are not tractors. Tractors do not bleed and cry. Tractors do not have families and children. We are not machines. We are human beings." It seemed to me the whisper of James was never as clear as it was on that day. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have flattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. James 5, verse 4 to 6. It is the warm joy and humility of these workers that has wooed people into their movement. I remembered one of these recent marches went on when we walked the corporate headquarters of Yum, the company that owns Taco Bell and many others. The workers simply hung out their dirty work clothes, hundreds and hundreds of shirts stained by hours of sweating beneath the sun of the fields, in the fields. Another prophetic stunt to reach the ears of powerful people who had grown so detached from the sweat and tears of peasants and workers, and to make it personal. And it was not like before. The Presbyterian Church joined the workers in the boycott of Taco Bell. One congregation had received a grant from Yum Corporation, but they said that while the grant money would really come in handy for their poor congregation, they wanted to give it to the workers, to whom it belongs, and they signed the check over to them. Student boycotts closed down Taco Bell on college campuses until they would listen to the farm workers. Congregations and youth groups told me that they were writing letters to the owners of Taco Bell. Not angry letters, but kind letters that hoped for and believed in redemption. And a few months ago, after I'd gone nearly 5 years without chapalas, I always said, why couldn't it have been Checkers or something, not Taco Bell. The owners of Taco Bell agreed not only to meet the workers' demands, but to sit down and meet with them face to face. Taco Bell's executive even issued a statement encouraging other fast food franchises to ask who the hidden faces are behind their food and how they are being treated. That's the irresistible revolution. Though, of course, it's not the end of their struggle. The world of efficiency and anonymity dehumanizes us. We see people as machines, as tractors, or as issues to protest. We live in an age when machines act like people and people act like machines, but machines cannot love. We have to ask who the invisible people are, who make our clothes, who pick our vegetables, and how they are treated. Growing up, I was told not to wear a t-shirt that advertised a brand unless I agreed with what they stood for. But I was never told to do the same with companies I advertise inadvertently. What do they stand for? What did the gospel proclaim? There is a brilliant scene in Michael Moore's documentary, The Big One, where Philip Knight, founder and former CEO of Nike, which has become notorious for its abuse of workers overseas, invites Moore to talk with him. So Moore goes in and meets with Knight bearing a gift, 2 first-class tickets to Indonesia, and he invites Knight to fly to Indonesia and simply walk through his factories. Phil bursts out laughing and shakes his head. No, not a chance. Moore tells him that he just wants to walk through and check out the operation, and then asks, have you ever been to see your factories where your shoes are made? Have you ever been to Indonesia? Knight says, no, and I'm not going to. These are the layers of separation that allow injustice to happen. It is not the people who are malicious. I do not think we are naturally able to hurt each other. Even Philip Knight seems like too nice of a guy for that. But we keep ourselves at a safe distance. I am also reminded of the gatherings each year down in Fort Benning, Georgia, outside the U.S. Army School of the Americas, a military camp for trained soldiers from Latin America, and has a notorious and humiliating past. Graduates of the school have committed atrocities in Latin America, including 1980 assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, along with the massacres of the indigenous poor and religious leaders who have joined their struggle. Each year, over 10,000 folks gather for a silent procession onto the property, simply holding white crosses with the names of thousands who have lost their lives. As the vigil proceeds, each name is read aloud and everyone responds, present, or presente, presente. This is the spirit of gentleness that moves us to imagine new alternatives, driven by the sacredness of each life, which is no longer hidden in the shadows, becoming human. Over and over, people have told me that the power of my trip to Iraq is that it humanized the war, even for folks who otherwise might have not given it a second thought to the morality of what we were doing there. The war took on a face other than just Saddam or Osama, or even family members in the U.S. military. A few days before I left for Iraq, I settled into my seat on an airplane next to 2 strangers. They began talking to each other, discovering that they had much in common, particularly their political affliction. They cracked some jokes about liberals and boasted about the military presence in Iraq. I tried to read, tried to sleep, tried to resist the temptation to start an intense debate, which would have made for a long plane ride. Finally, I got out some homemade cookies and offered them to my neighbors. They continued talking about how much they had traveled, all the places they've been, and then they turned to me. Where's your next trip to? One of them asked. I got a lump in my throat and paused, since the honest answer was Baghdad, and I proceeded cautiously. Actually, next week I plan to go to Iraq. Their jaws dropped, puzzled. One man asked, with the military? I giggled. I don't exactly fit the military prototype, with my dreadlocks and all. No, I replied. I will be going as a Christian peacemaker to be with the families there and voice opposition to the war. I was amazed that they did not start arguing with me. They were intrigued that I believed in something so much that I would risk my life for it. We actually had a nice talk, and I will never forget what they said as we parted. These 2 people whom I just met told me with great drama how they would be glued to the TV as they worried about me, wondering if I would make it back safely. I stood in awe, knowing that this is the great tragedy. We have not put a face on the war. Degrees of separation allow us to destroy human beings we do not know except as the enemy. So in 1 hour, the walls came down a little. I thought of how powerful it was to have a face in Iraq. Albeit, a face these two had met for only a couple of hours on a plane, but now they hesitate as they hear drums of war. And in the moment of hesitation, the world is pregnant with possibilities. Granted, I would like for my two friends to oppose the war because of the families in Iraq, but if they oppose the war because of some goofball they met for an hour on a plane, that'll work for now. The Tears of Rizpah. Before and during my time in Iraq, I studied the powerful biblical story of a heroic woman named Rizpah, 2 Samuel 21, 1-14. It took on a completely new meaning for me as I lived among the women of Iraq who had seen their loved ones killed in war and faced the reality of more suffering. Rizpah lived in a time like ours. Kings were making treaties and breaking them. Verse 2. The land was stained with the blood of war to heal the famine that cursed Israel. David makes a deal in order to make amends with Gibeonites. The currency he uses is human lives, as with our present war. He hands human beings over to be massacred. Of course, they are not his own children. He takes the sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine, and Merab, Saul's daughter, and the children are killed and their bodies exposed before the Lord. Not only were they killed, but they were left on a hill without proper burial, left to be devoured by wild animals. And yet, despite David's effort, God does not heal the land yet. With the reckless love that only a grieving mother has, Rizpah takes sackcloth and spreads it out on the rock beside the bodies. She sets up camp. The text says she stays from the beginning of the harvest until the rains pour down, implying she was there for a season. Day after day, week after week, she protects the bodies from the birds and animals. And word of her encampment spreads across the land, making it all the way to the ears of King David. When he hears of her courage, he remembers Saul and his friend Jonathan. An incredible thing happens. He is moved to gather up the bones of all the dead. Human suffering has the power to move even kings to feel again. Rizpah pricks the humanity of a king who had become so dehumanized that he could exchange children like currency and see them die without remorse. Then there can be true liberation, where even kings can be set free. True revolution is when, as anti-apartheid leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner Bishop Desmond Tutu says, with a huge smile, the oppressed are freed from being oppressed, and the oppressors are freed from being oppressors. And this is when God heals the land. Verse 14. When I was in Iraq, I prayed that as lives are lost in the ancient land again, mothers would set up camp beside the bodies of their dead and wail so loudly that the world of the travesty would spread throughout the earth. Maybe people from around the world would hear and come out and sit with them on the rock beside the bodies. And we would groan together so loudly that even the kings would hear. Perhaps the kings would be moved to be human again, and then God would heal our land. Maybe that's the most transformative thing we could have done after September 11th. And when the scriptures in Isaiah 2 verse 4 and Micah 4:3 say that the people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, the verses end with the words, nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. The transformation begins with the people, with ordinary radicals, courageous mothers and grandmothers like Rizpah. When we begin enacting the new world, the nations will follow. Nations will not lead us to peace. It is people who will lead the nations to peace as they begin to humanize the nations. Protesters and prophets. One of the movements when I felt move toward a gentler revolution was during the Republican National Convention when it came to Philadelphia in 1998. It was election year, and once again poor people were running for their lives. Somehow, my community partner Jamie and I got into the conversation. Call it divine providence or savvy politics. We got special passes onto the main arena floor. We were dropped off at the front door by our own private golf cart. The friendly, enthusiastic GOP volunteers escorted us in. We need not fear their surveillance too much. So there I was, a young Republican, suit and tie disguise, complete with a little gold elephant pin. But underneath I was ready. I had painted my shirt to read, "Woe to those who deprive the poor of their rights," Isaiah 10. And on the back were the words, "Jesus, woe to you who are rich, but blessed are the poor," Luke 6. We were able to get very close, about 20 yards from the stage. After the introduction of George W. Bush, as soon as the thundering applause faded into eager silence, I rose and tore off my outer layer to reveal my shirt. And at the top of my lungs, I began quoting the scriptures. In their distress, the conventioneers tried to drown me out by interrupting George's first words with applause. The ovation died down, and the words of Jesus blared forth, "Blessed are the poor, but woe to you who are the rich." Again they clapped. Then Romans 8, creation is groaning for liberation. Security people frantically ran around. I was soon pounced on by the Secret Service and removed. They locked me in a closet so we could talk. Through the locked door, I could hear them conferring with each other. I heard them say, "Maybe we can charge him with protesting. If so, we can hold him for several days." So they came back and asked, "Are you a protester?" I thought for a second, a very brief second. "No, sir," I said plainly. "I am not a protester. I am a prophet." I was held in custody a bit longer and then released with no charges, but a few strange grins. They even gave me a golf cart ride back to the car. I said it half in jest with a little smile, knowing that if I had agreed that I was a protester, I would go to jail. To be honest, I wouldn't normally claim such a pretentious title as prophet, nor do I see many of the biblical prophets running around throwing the title around. Besides, protesters might go to jail, but prophets usually get killed. As old Bob Marley sings in Redemption Song, "How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look?" But it did warrant more thought, and as I watched the riots in the streets of Philly over the next few days, my heart sank at all the violence and hatred. It didn't feel like we were moving closer to a better world. Protesters are everywhere, but I think the world is desperately in need of prophets. Those little voices that can point us towards another future. Some of us have spent so much time fighting what we are against that we can barely remember what we are for, whether in the church or in the circle of social dissonant. There are plenty of people who define themselves by what they are not, whose identity revolve around what they are against rather than what they are for. It's sort of in the DNA of Protestants. Church history shows how good Protestants are at dissonant. But once they are in charge, no one knows what to do. Most people are aware that something is wrong. The real question is, what are the alternatives? Protesters are still on the fringes like satellites, revolving around the system, but prophets and poets lead us into a new world, beyond simply yelling at the old one. In many ways, protesters fit into the dominant system, legitimizing the current order with careful compartmentalization dissent. A one-dimensional society can absorb dissent in a way that even further empowers its domination. People watch it on TV and know that they are not one of those, and teach their kids the comfort of slavery rather than the slavery of comfort. And sympathetic liberals applaud the valiant courage of resistors from their comfortable couches as if someone had made a touchdown. A revolution that laughs. During the war, people became so polarized that hatred and anger seemed to dominate, no matter which side you were on. Friends at the Camden House, a sister community to the Simple Way, did something beautiful. They each dressed in sackcloth branded with one of the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Fruits that most revolutionaries are starving for. And then they walked into the middle of the protests, a witness of the Spirit to both the warmongers and the bush bashers. That's the sort of thing that makes us laugh and nudges us all a little closer to God. One night, a couple of my housemates sneaked into my room carrying a life-size poster of President Bush hugging a little girl. They climbed up on my bunk and hung it from the ceiling just a few feet above my bed. I came in late that night, and my roommate was already asleep, so I crawled into bed in the dark, oblivious to it all. The next morning, the first thing I saw when I awoke was George W. Bush staring me dead in the eye and nearly lying on top of me. Now that's funny. I left it there so that I see him every night when I go to bed and each morning when I get up. That would give some folks nightmares. For others, it would help them to rest secure. For me, it reminds me that President Bush is human, neither the Antichrist nor the Savior, and that allows me to sleep well. Humor. That's something most liberals and conservatives have in common. They've forgotten how to laugh, and the world is starving for joy. I'll never forget one of the times I became so convinced that God is committed to making us laugh at ourselves, especially those of us who take ourselves so seriously. First, you need to know that I have been to a fair amount of protests against death penalty. It's a big deal here in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, like many cities and states, has passed a memoriam bill to halt executions because of significant proof of a class of ethnic bias. Recently, several people have been exonerated after serving years in prison and nearly been executed. There is also a high-profile case of Mumbai Abu Jamal, who is a very dubious trial, was convicted of killing a Philadelphian police officer and has spent over 20 years in prison. And of course, we have friends on death row, some of whom are innocent. One man wrote us a letter that just said, "Please help." So I've done a fair amount of organizing and educating on the death penalty, and the issue has human faces for me. I have spent many days outside the office of the district attorney, Leanne Abraham, for seeking the death penalty on so many cases and building up Philadelphia Country Death Row to the country's third largest. The New York Times dubbed her America's deadliest DA. Now here's the beautiful event. A few years back, I was invited to speak to a gathering of thousands of Christians. I was led onto the stage, where I was seated in a line of people who would be speaking. I guess I expected to see the cast of usual suspects, preachers and teachers. As I sat down, I looked to the left, only to see Leah Abram. I recognized her from seeing her face plastered on posters. I had no idea what to do. I thought of interrupting her speech. I thought of spending my talk time reacting to her. Instead, I just listened and prayed. I felt a strange peace, and must I admit, I was quite prepared to feel some prophetic fire. But I just sat there, as words of the prophets demanding God's justice for the poor danced in my mind. I wrote a few of them down on a piece of paper, and when she sat back down next to me, I quietly passed it to her, along with a note that said I would be praying for her to be filled with God's love and grace, and begging her to pray for the same for me. She smiled at me and said thank you as she left. Before listening to my speech, I might add, her name has joined the host of those engraved in our chapel, for whom I regularly cry out to God. And she left her cup at that gathering, so I picked it up, and it's in my closet. Hopefully someday I'll have the chance to give it back to her and chat with her over coffee. I take great courage from the fact that many of us are taking steps towards a gentler revolution. We need more prophets who laugh and dance in our living room. We have an Emma Goldman quote, "If I can't dance, then it's not my revolution." Whenever people talk about injustice, usually there's a cloud of guilt looming over them. Joy and celebration don't usually mark progressive social justice circles, or conservative Christian circles for that matter. But the Jesus movement is a revolution that dances, celebration at the very core of our kingdom. And hopefully that celebration will make its way into the darkest corners of our world, the ghettos and refugee camps, and the palaces and prisons. May the whispers of hope reach the ears of hope-hungry people in the shadows of our world.